today's lesson will be about. Today's lesson is going to be about emotions. Now, we all start with a primary set, and as we grow older, we acquire more of them.
When your emotions control your action, it affects not only yourself, but the people around you.
This will help. Sit down. Emotions are centered in the lower part of the brain.
It is complicated, yes, but mysterious no longer.
Emotional behavior is largely involuntary.
I can't believe that.
We have certain basic emotions which are controlled subconsciously. Notice your own emotional reactions. What did you feel? What did you do?
Under control, your emotions can make you healthier and happier and improve the lives of people around you.
This is pretty clever.
That's a rather simplified suggestion of a complex mental process, but you get the idea.
Well, we're continuing with our series on emotions, and we're talking, this is our third sermon on anger. And as we talked about previously, the reason we've done 3 sermons on anger is because I believe we live in a fairly angry culture, and it's probably more angry than we realize, and it's a huge impediment to experiencing the joy that should be found in a life with Jesus. It's really difficult to be joyful and angry at the same time. Maybe you've experienced that. But it really is not easy to do. And so we need to look at anger and learn to use it as God intended it to be used, but to put away the aspects of it that are detrimental to us and to the people around us. Today we're going to be looking again at Ephesians chapter 4. We're going to be looking at the 25th, 26th, and 29th verse, because this gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. So previously we talked about how a lot of our anger comes from a breakdown. There's a big breakdown in our culture. There's a breakdown theologically that's happened for us. And because of that, our access to glory is very limited, and that causes anger. We also talked about how God is really in the business of anger, and that God, remember that anger is an emotion that protects, and God's job is protection. So when it talks about in the Bible God being angry, we shouldn't be afraid of that, but we should trust in that God is out there to protect those things of value. Now, today we're going to be talking about how it is that you use your anger well. How do you use your anger properly? And for that, we're turning to Ephesians chapter 4. So in verse 25, it says, "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger." And then in verse 29 it says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." Really what this passage is talking about the purpose of anger and how when you're angry it can be used for something good instead of something detrimental. Now it's important to understand that this starts off with recognizing that we are members of one another. And that always has to be in our minds as we become angry, that you are a member of one another. It's really fascinating to me that anger, one of the things that we do with anger is we tend to tear things down, and we tend to tear people down. The problem is that we don't really get angry with people unless there's some kind of, they're in some kind of union with us. Have you noticed that sometimes the people that are closest to you can make you the most angry? Well, it's kind of true that we don't really get angry with people unless there's some kind of union we have with them. That union might be small. It might be just the fact that they're members of the same city that we are, but there's still a union there. And the problem is that when we tear down people that we're in union with, what does that do to us? I heard a psychologist say that you never win an argument with your wife. And that's not just because it's hard to win an argument with your wife. It's because that even if he points out that even if you win, let's say you win every argument with your wife. You win 100 arguments with your wife. Well, now she's a loser, and now you're married to a loser. How did you win? How did you win? You see, when the idea is that when we're angry with people that are around us, that are connected with us, and we use that anger inappropriately, we end up tearing them down, and that ends up tearing us down. If you recognize that we are connected with one another, that we are members with one another, then you will understand that anger is there to actually build up the body, not to destroy it. And that's why he says, put away every falsehood. Think clearly. Understand things rightly. Put away every falsehood. Let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members with one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. And then in verse 29, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So we're supposed to use in our anger, we're supposed to use language that is truthful, that ends up building up people and building up the body. How do you do that? It's not easy. Well, first of all, I think the first lesson that we'll look at today is that you need to learn to suffer well. The second thing is you need to be aware of the deceitfulness of the heart. And thirdly, we'll talk about fighting the good fight. So how do we do this? How do we use our anger to build up? Well, the first thing we need to learn is to learn to suffer well. Now, this seems strange, but it's true. And so it's not the best news you probably heard all day, right? You come to a church and the pastor says, hey, you need to learn how to suffer better. Get better at suffering. And some of you might say, hey, I've been suffering a lot. Hey, it's good practice. See, there's no laughs. There's no smiles. You guys are very serious about this today. So here's the thing. Anger is protective. The problem is that a lot of times when we're angry, what are we protecting? We're protecting ourselves. What are we protecting ourselves from? We're protecting ourselves from suffering. Have you guys noticed that? That a lot of times your anger is actually about protecting yourself and protecting yourself from suffering. And in fact, it's easy to become bitter in your life where you're so used to protecting yourself from being hurt, that you're in that protective mode all the time. I think that's what bitterness really is. You're in a protective mode all the time. You're afraid of getting hurt. You're afraid of the pain and suffering that comes with interacting with people, with being united with people, because it will cause you pain. And you're saying to yourself, I am done with this pain. I am done with this suffering. I am going to protect myself at all costs. And so you have a low level of anger all the time in your life. You're just ready for the time when you need to protect yourself. Let me tell you that is not a healthy way to live. It's not a joyful way to live. It's not any kind of way to live that any of us wants. And so how do you get over this? Now, the problem is you want me to say that there's some way that you can get through life without suffering, and I should tell you that secret of how you get through life without suffering, and then you won't need to be bitter anymore, and you won't have to have anger about protecting yourself. Unfortunately, I can't tell you that. There really isn't any secret to getting through life without suffering. You know, the creator of the universe, Jesus Christ, came down to this life and he suffered. Every character you read about in the Bible, they suffered. Now, here's the thing. Suffering can't be avoided. Suffering can't be avoided, but it can be redeemed. And it's important to know the distinction, because if you get that distinction wrong, if you think suffering can be avoided, you're going to orient your life to try to do that, and it's going to backfire on you. But if you understand that suffering can't be avoided, but it can be redeemed, then you will understand that suffering is part of life, and you will look for ways to redeem it rather than ways to avoid it. The original suffering that we experienced as humankind came in the garden, and it was because of our understanding of our own inadequacy. When Adam and Eve ate the fruit, it said they realized that they were naked. That's a picture of inadequacy. And it said that what they did was they sewed fig leaves on themselves to hide their nakedness. What they did was they realized that they were inadequate, but they kind of decided to cover that inadequacy up. It didn't solve the inadequacy. It didn't make them adequate. It just made them appear not to be inadequate. The problem is as you go through life, if you're going to be wise, you're going to have your eyes opened. And the more your eyes are open, the more you're going to see your own inadequacy. And that's a painful thing. But the Bible has a lot to say about suffering and sacrifice, and it's important to understand this in light of this truth. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21 through 23, it says, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps." Do you see that? Did you know that this was part of the deal? Christ suffered for you, leaving an example so that you might follow in his steps. Guess what? Part of being a Christian is learning how to suffer well. In verse 22 it says, it continues, "He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in turn. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." Do you understand what that's saying? Is that Jesus was perfect. He had no deceit in him. He had no limits in him. He had no problem. There was no defect in him. He was perfect. And yet when he came down here to this earth, what happened? It said he was reviled. The perfect creator of the universe came down to earth, and he was reviled as if he had all kinds of faults and flaws with him. And this passage is telling us that rather than becoming angry and protecting himself from the suffering of being reviled by reviling somebody else, rather than do that, what did he do? It says he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He bore the suffering of having people revile him and said, you know what, ultimately, it's not what you guys think of me that's important. It's what God thinks of me. Ultimately, my value is not placed in your hands. My value is placed in the hands of the Father. Now, here's the thing. He didn't have any faults or flaws to deal with, but we do. You know the criticism that really hurts? The one that's true. And that's the one that'll make you angry, isn't it? When you know kind of deep down that there's something about you that's not great, there's something about you that needs work, there's something about you that's a fault or a flaw, and somebody finds that fault or flaw and they poke it. They say, this is what you are. This is how you're acting. This is what you're doing. This is the problem with you. If you know that if somebody comes to me and says, hey, you know what, Steve, the problem is you're just too fit. You're way too fit. You spend way too much. Thank you, Levi. Thank you. See, when Levi says that to me just now, far too handsome. Thank you. Guess what? That kind of criticism doesn't bother me. I didn't get angry just now. But there's a lot of other criticisms that you guys could level at me that would be true. And to the extent that I know that they're true, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt. But the thing is that it says that Jesus' example was an example for us. And what's that example? The example is to suffer people reviling you, but to trust that your worth and your glory are in the hands of one who judges justly. And not only does he judge justly, but he judges graciously. You know what that means? That means this. When people revile me, there's something to fall back on. What can I fall back on? I can fall back on the judgment of God. And you say, well, doesn't God know your faults more than anybody else? Oh, yes, he does. Well, so how does that help? Well, it helps because of something really important. Christ suffered for you. Do you know who took all the suffering for my faults and flaws? Christ did. Why? Because Christ initiated a covenant with me. And when Christ initiated a covenant with me, he joined with me. We are joined together. We are locked together. Our fates are intertwined. And you know what part of the fate that Jesus took? He took being reviled. There was nothing to revile about him, and yet he took being reviled. Why? Because I have things about me that are worthy of being reviled. That's why Jesus took the being reviled. It wasn't because he had things to be sad about, to be upset about, to be criticized. It's because I have things to be criticized. And so Jesus took the criticism, the reviling on my behalf. Well, what do I get from that? You know what I get from that? I shared with him my worth, and he shares with me his worth. What I shared with him was being reviled, and what he shares with me is being glorified. So when I stand before God, the judge who judges justly, he's going to judge Christ. And he's going to judge Christ justly. Do you understand? Because I'm united with Christ, then when I get judged by God justly, I get justly judged as Jesus. So the question is, knowing that, can I put up with the suffering that I have to go through in this life? The redemption in suffering is found in giving suffering meaning. Not only is my suffering a way of participating with Christ, but also my suffering is about the loss of something of value. You know, when we suffer, there's all kinds of things that we suffer in this life and make us angry. Sometimes it's the loss of glory and dignity that comes when people criticize us. Sometimes it's the loss of a house burns down. We get mad about that. Sometimes it's the loss of a loved one. We get upset when that happens. But we're losing something of value. And because of that, we're suffering. But in facing the loss forthrightly, we actually have an opportunity to gain. What do we gain by facing this loss forthrightly? Well, we can become people of grace, people of understanding, people of love. If you've ever met a really gracious person who really has an ability to extend love to other people, I can almost guarantee you that you will be with a person who has faced suffering and loss. Have you ever noticed that sometimes you're with people who are older and they're just the most gracious, sweet people that you've ever met? And you'll start to talk to them, and sometimes I've had this experience as a pastor. We have people in our congregation who are older who are the most gracious, loving people. And I'll just think in my mind, I'll just imagine what their life was like. And it's almost never what it was really like. In fact, most times when I talk to older people and they're so gracious, I'll talk to them and I'll find out that there is a depth of suffering that I never would have guessed. That some point in their life, they had suffering cast upon them. They had serious loss. They had serious things that they were going through. And I think to myself, why would such a lovely person have to go through so much? But sometimes maybe we don't understand that a lot of the loveliness comes from the fact that they went through so much. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 34, it says, "For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one." This passage gets to two aspects of suffering that are really important. The first one is that when you suffer, you have something that puts you in common with somebody else who suffers, and you can identify with them in a way that you couldn't if you hadn't gone through the suffering. That's just the way that it is. Have you guys ever been on a camping trip, and it starts pouring and you're cold, you're wet? You know what makes that a little bit better is when you're with other people who are cold and wet. And sometimes you get to the point where you start joking about it, but you wouldn't be joking about it if you're out there by yourself cold and wet. You'd be miserable. You'd be lonely. But now because everybody's cold and wet, the joke starts going around, haha, this is funny, we're cold and wet. And pretty soon, because you're sharing that experience, it's less than it was before. You know, that's what happens when we suffer. So we can't get angry every time we suffer because we have to understand that God is allowing it for something that is good, That goodness can be brought, unity can be brought through that. But the second thing he says here is that you accepted the plundering of your property since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Sometimes when we lose things, what happens is it makes us turn to other things. When we lose some kind of stability, some kind of glory in our life, it makes us reevaluate our lives and we turn to something that has maybe deeper value and deeper glory. And that's what this passage is talking about. He's saying, look, you guys lost your property, but you know that this isn't your real home, that you have a more abiding home. You have a different city. Your citizenship is in heaven. And because you lost some of the things on this earth, you turned to things that were spiritual. You turned to things that were heavenly. And good things came out of that. And then in Hebrews 13, verse 3, it says, remember those who are in prison as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you are also in the body. And you're united with one another. And so when you suffer, think about it not as me suffering, think about it as me being able to take some of the suffering of the group. Me being able to take some of the suffering that will help me to understand somebody else. You know, the interesting thing is people who learn to suffer well avoid becoming angry and bitter people. There's a toughness to their character. There's a strength and a resiliency to them. Because really, I think what happens is in loss, we experience a suffering that is often really the loss of the fig leaves that we've used to cover ourselves up and cover our inadequacy. You know, there's a lot of things I can put on my life to make me feel better about the fact that I am a sinful person. But sometimes when those things get taken away, rather than relying on them, what I rely on is Christ. I rely on the fact that it's really Christ who is the answer to my inadequacy. It's really Christ, and that's all that it is. I will not be judged for the sins that I have because Jesus Christ volunteered to be judged in my place. And that is more than any fig leaf could ever provide for me. What happens, I think, is that when we defend ourselves and try to keep those fig leaves, when we defend ourselves, when we get angry and try to keep from suffering, we end up losing the ability to see ourselves clearly and the ability to see others as we should. And so part of the deal is just learning to suffer well. Now, secondly, there's another thing that we have to understand before we can use anger well, and that's beware of the deceitfulness of the heart. Now, here, this is a real problem that we have to face. How many times have you guys thought, I am justified in my anger, and my anger is going to accomplish something good, and then it all turns south? I will raise my hand. That has happened to me more than once. Has it happened to you guys? You think, oh, this is it. I'm righteous in my anger. My anger is going to accomplish something good, and then it just kind of falls apart. Why does that happen? It happens because our hearts are deceitful. In fact, Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? Here's the thing. God gave us anger for a reason. God's not dumb. Anger motivates us to protect things of value. The problem is that our heart being deceitful turns that gift and turns it into something that's incredibly destructive. And so I want to talk to you about three problems of our deceitful heart. Deceit number one is stealth anger. Okay, deceit number one is stealth anger. Here's the problem. A lot of times, have you ever found yourself, somebody goes, oh, why are you mad about this? Or, are you mad? And you say, no, I'm not mad, but you really are. Have you ever been that? Why do we do that? It's kind of funny. Why do we do that? Oh, I'm sorry. Are you angry about this? No, I'm not mad. And you really are. Why do we do that? We do that because we see anger as something that diminishes our glory, and we don't want to admit to that. We want to take a high road over somebody else, and we want to say, no, I'm above that. I'm not angry. But here's the problem, and this is a real problem. When you do that, the likelihood of your anger producing something good is very, very small. Very small. Why is that? Well, first of all, self-deception is not really conducive to working through problems very well. You know what I'm saying? If you're going to work through problems with somebody, you guys need to see things clearly. And if you're deceiving yourself about your emotional state, that's not a step in the right direction towards solving the problem. But the second thing, the most important thing about this stealth anger and the problem that it creates is it gets you out of evaluating and justifying your anger. You know what you do when you say, "Oh, I'm not angry"? You don't have to deal with the fact that you're angry. It gets you out of that. "Oh, I'm not angry. I'm not doing this because I'm angry." No, yes, you are. And once you admit that you're angry, you can say to yourself, "Is my anger justified? Should I be angry about this? In my anger, should I be acting the way that I'm acting?" Because most of the time, our suspicion is no, so we just say, "Well, I'm not going to admit to being angry at all." Have you guys ever done that? It's not helpful and it's not conducive. So the first thing you have to do is admit that you're angry. I am angry. Now, is my anger justified? Am I right to be angry about this? And secondly, if I am justified in being angry, am I justified in doing what I'm doing? Evaluate your anger. Make it stand the test. Don't just give it a pass by not admitting that it's there. Deceit number 2, I like to call likely story. And the reason I like to call it likely story is evaluate your narrative. First of all, evaluate whether you're angry or not. The second one is evaluate your narrative. Have you ever done this? Well, that person's I know that they were doing this because they just don't like me, and I know that they don't like me, and I know that that's why they did this, and you create this whole narrative. We all have that. We all have a running narrative. We're all the stars in our own movie, right? That's going on constantly. And so we're constantly telling ourselves things about what happened. But here's the key to understand, is generally speaking, things don't make you angry. Your likely story about what's actually happening is what's making you angry. What I mean by that is you're adding in all kinds of things to the story that makes you the victim in this, and a lot of times that's actually what's making you angry. Have you ever been in a situation where you tell somebody, "Oh, this person did this to me," and they're like, "Okay, so?" No, you don't understand. You don't understand. They don't like me. They don't like me. And then you go off with the tale of all the things that have happened in the past and the fact that they don't like you. And then the person goes, "Oh, okay, I see that the answer you want is yes, you're justified and you're angry. So yes, I understand why you're angry." You know, and so what's happened is we've told ourselves this long tale. But the thing is that have you also noticed that when we tell the tale about our own selves, that it doesn't look anything like that? "Well, I was just trying to do something good for you. I was just trying to help you." You guys know what I'm talking about? Likely story. So here's the thing. If you're going to use your anger well, not only evaluate whether or not your anger is justified, but evaluate the story that you're telling. Be honest with it. You know, have you noticed that it says, "Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak truth to his neighbor, for we are members of one another." Therefore, having put away falsehood. You have to put away all falsehood. And one of the greatest falsehoods that we engage in is the stories that we tell ourselves. A lot of times we do Satan's work for him because Satan doesn't need to lie to us. We're busy lying to ourselves. And so get rid of those likely stories. Be honest. Try to look at it from multiple points of view. Try to evaluate it objectively. Ascribing motives to people, not assuming the best of others, that's not a good way to use your anger well. In fact, almost all the time, that derails it right there. Deceit number 3, I call mountains from molehills. The biggest thing is this worth a fight? Is this worth a fight? Is this worth my anger? What am I defending right now? What's the big worthwhile thing that's in jeopardy if I don't jump in here with my anger? And what you'll find is a lot of times there isn't anything. Or sometimes you'll find that what you're defending from anger isn't yours to defend. How many of you guys get really mad when people in traffic do things that they're not supposed to do? You get really mad. I do. You know what? I am secretly California or Arizona Highway Patrolman. Secretly, I almost said CHP because too much chips in my past. You guys remember the show Chips? Okay. Too much chips. But I'm secretly a police officer apparently, because when people do things wrong, I get upset about it. Is it my problem? Is it my job to go run them down? Is it my job to punish them? Is it my job? No, it's not. What am I getting upset about? Am I making a mountain out of a molehill? What am I defending? Does this really come? Here's the real thing about mountains out of molehills. Does this really come from other emotions? And most of the time what you'll find is that underneath this little molehill that's become a huge mountain in your life is another emotion that really needs to be dealt with. That emotion could be pride. That emotion could be fear. That emotion could be loneliness. It could be a feeling of inferiority. But sometimes lurking under there, you're making a mountain out of a molehill, not because this is a big deal, but because you have some emotion under there that needs to be addressed. Finally, we need to look at fighting the good fight. So if you've gone through all this and you've kind of looked at your emotions, you've looked at what's going on, and you're like, no, this is something that needs to be defended. This is something, there needs to be a fight here. How do you fight the good fight? This is super important. You're being told right now in church by a pastor that you need to be angry and fight. This is a perfect day, right? This is a perfect day. So here's the thing. Notice that in verse 26 it says, be angry and do not sin. Be angry. There's times for anger. The body needs defending at times. So there's times to have the good fight. So having cleared the decks for action about all the stuff that we've talked about before, now you can fight. But here's the thing. First of all, you need to figure out who your fight is against. And it's not who you think. You see, what happens when we enter into a covenant and I exchange identities with Christ, I live for Him and He's living for me. When that happens, then what happens is there's an exchange of enemies. That my enemies are no longer my enemies. That's Jesus' job. Jesus' job is my glory and my sanctification, all that kind of stuff. What is my enemy? My enemy is what's an enemy of Christ. And we call that sin. And your fight is not against your enemy, the person standing in front of you. Your fight is against Christ's enemy, the sin in that person. There are times when you will have to confront somebody who's doing something wrong. And it's important to understand that they are not your enemy. The sin that's got a hold of them is your enemy. And that makes all the difference in the world because you will approach this two different ways. One if you think that he is your enemy, one if you think his sin is your enemy. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 through 45, Jesus gives some of the most improbable advice in all of religious literature. He says, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven, for He makes His sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the just and the unjust. Do you see how amazing that passage is? He's saying something that's totally doesn't make any sense. He's saying your enemies, you have enemies out there. Your job is not to hate them. Your job is to love them and pray for them. Well, why? And the way he lays it out is so perfect. He says, that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Here's what's happened is when I became locked in this covenant with Christ, now I'm a son of God. And if I'm going to be a son of God, if that's going to be real, I need to act on that. And part of acting on that is acting like I'm a son of God and saying, look, what is my real enemy here? My enemy is not Steve's enemy. Because I'm not living for Steve anymore. I'm living for Christ. I am a son. I'm to act like a son. I'm to act like this covenant is real, and I'm really a son of God. And so my enemy is not that person that's in front of me. It's the sin that has a hold of them. That's my enemy. And so if you work towards dealing with them in that way, most likely your fight, your anger will be productive and not destructive. So how do you actually do that? What are some steps you can take in the midst of this? First of all, attack the lowest level. This is super important. I can't emphasize how important this is. Attack the lowest level. What does that mean? Have you ever been mad at somebody and you say, you always do this. You always do this. Anyone use the always? I will admit that I use the always. You always do this. You are the biggest, worst, lousiest, and you go on from there. Here's the thing. You know what they did? Is they didn't screw on the peanut butter lid quite enough. And so what happens is you go straight from the fact that they didn't this time screw on the peanut butter lid tight enough to the fact that they've always been a terrible person. You see what I'm saying? Like there's different levels of problem. And when you're dealing with the person and you're trying to deal with the sin, you deal with the lowest possible problem. You don't elevate it to the fact that they've never been a decent human being in their entire existence. Because now you're attacking the person. You're not attacking the sin. You're not attacking the problem. What you want to do is you want to say, here's the thing. In this moment right now, I think that what you're doing is wrong and it's having some effects. This doesn't mean you're a terrible person. This doesn't mean you always do this. This doesn't mean any of that. This means that right now I think there might be some sin going on here that's causing some problems. It's destroying things in your life that you want. There's some valuable things that are at stake here for you that you are in the process of destroying because of this particular action right now, and I don't think you want that. So let's work together at getting through this. Let's work together at not destroying this. Let's work together at building this up. Take responsibility for your feelings. It's important for the person to know what is at stake, but you have to make sure that you take responsibility. You can say things like, I feel this way when this happens. Is this what your intention is? I feel like you're destroying something right now that's really important. Is that what you're trying to do? Because I didn't think it was. You know, when you assume the best about somebody and take responsibility for your own feelings, that goes a long way to making the outcome a good one. Another thing that we need to do when we're fighting the good fight is separate persons, offices, and behaviors. Now, this is important. There is a person who has an office, and as part of that office, has certain behaviors. What do I mean by that? Okay, there is a person. His name is Steve. He has an office. He is a husband. He is a father. He is whatever. And as part of those offices, he has to do certain things. Now, you need to draw distinctions between those things. Why is that? Because sometimes you have to defend your office, and that's not the same thing as defending yourself. What do I mean by that? This is really important to understand in anger. Okay, how many of you guys have ever been a leader of some kind in something ever in your life, your entire life? Okay? How many of you, as a leader in anything in your entire life, have ever been criticized as the leader? Right? Now, what do you do with that? You just don't do anything? Maybe you get real depressed about it. You know, there's a lot of different options. Well, one of the things you have to do is you have to separate person, office, and behavior. What's being criticized right now? Am I being criticized as a person? Is my office being criticized? Or is my behavior being criticized? Which one of these things is being criticized? And then you need to evaluate that. But the reason that's important is because sometimes you have to use your anger to defend things that are very close to you. What do I mean by that? Let's say you're a teacher and some kid is showing disrespect to you. You might say, from a personal level, I'm just going to let that go. Not bothering me that much. Is there a danger in that? Yeah, there's a huge danger in that. Because it's possible that what their behavior is doing is destroying your office. And you know what? Those students need you in that office. The classroom is depending upon respect for that office. Nothing's going to happen. Nobody's going to learn, maybe for the entire semester, if you don't defend that office. And so maybe you're fine with it, but you still need to defend it. Why? Because the office is being destroyed, and that office is necessary. Maybe as a father, you're in those roles sometimes. You know what? Personally, I can let this slide, but as your dad, I cannot let you talk to me this way. Because our family and the good of our family is going to be destroyed if we don't all do our jobs. You see, the thing to ultimately understand is that we are working for glory. That's what we're working for. Now, our glory is secure. So what are we working for? We're working for the glory of God. And the thing is, God is glorified when things function well. when families function well, when classrooms function well, when societies function well. And in order for that to function, there are some boundaries and some things that need to be, there's some valuable things that need to be defended. And so anger has to be a part of who we are, but it needs to be well controlled, and it needs to be something that's oriented to the glory of God. And when that happens, things thrive and God is glorified. It's important to understand that we all have a glory cloud around us. And our anger can seriously destroy the things that reflect our glory. And God wants us to have things that ultimately have value. He wants us to have things of glory around us. It's also important to remember that you are part of God's glory cloud, that you are reflecting His glory. And so your anger just isn't your own. It's just not yours. It has to be put in service to Christ because we were bought with a price. Now, finally, there's some application to think about. One of them is believe in God's glory. God is so glorious. Man, and if you don't believe how glorious He is, you will never believe in the goodness of what He has given you because God is giving you His glory. All through Scripture, it talks about the riches of what we have in Christ Jesus and the glory of what we have. And God is giving you, as His Son, He is giving you glory. And if you believe in God's glory, you will see the goodness of the gifts you have in Him. Belong to Him through a covenant. It's important to understand that if He's going to give you His glory, then you need to give yours back. That your job is not to glorify yourself any longer. You've given that up. That is over with. Now your life revolves around glorifying Him. And finally, participate in that glory by the transformation of God's Spirit within you. You will become a different person when you decide that you are living for Him. There are so many things that God wants to give us. Let's not let anger destroy them.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian Church, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.